The night was suffocating in Southampton County, Virginia. August 21st, 1831. The air was thick with humidity that clung to your skin like a wet shroud, carrying the sweet scent of tobacco leaves and something else. Something darker. Something that made the hair on your neck stand up, even if you couldn't quite name what it was. It was the kind of night where even the crickets seemed to whisper secrets, where shadows moved with purpose, where the very atmosphere felt pregnant with violence waiting to be born. Inside the Travis house, a modest two-story wooden structure painted white like so many plantation homes across the South, the family slept soundly. Joseph Travis, a wheelwright and small plantation owner, lay beside his wife Sally, their breathing slow and peaceful. In the adjoining rooms, their children dreamed innocent dreams, unaware that this would be their last night on earth. The house creaked softly in the humid air, the way old wooden buildings do when the night grows deep. Candles flickered in their holders, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed almost alive, almost watching. The smell of tallow mixed with the lingering aroma of the evening meal, creating a sense of domestic tranquility that was about to be shattered forever. Outside, the moon hung low and full, bathing the Virginia countryside in silver light. Cotton fields stretched in every direction, row after row of the white gold that had built the economy of the South on the backs of human bondage. In slave quarters scattered across the plantation, men, women, and children slept fitfully on straw mattresses, their bodies aching from another day of unpaid labor under the scorching sun. But one man was not sleeping. In the darkness beyond the Travis house, a figure stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the peaceful scene before him. Nat Turner, 31 years old, stood barely 5.5 feet tall, but in that moment, he seemed to loom larger than the night itself. His face, weathered by years of field work and marked by old scars from countless beatings, was set in an expression of terrible determination. In his calloused hands, he gripped a hatchet. The metal gleamed dully in the moonlight, its edge honed sharp enough to split kindling or a human skull with equal ease. This was no random act of violence brewing in the Virginia darkness. This was the culmination of months of planning, years of rage, and a lifetime of systematic brutalization that had finally reached its breaking point. This was the beginning of the bloodiest slave revolt in American history, led by a man who believed that God Almighty had personally commanded him to kill. Nat Turner wasn't just any enslaved person. He was a preacher, a prophet to his people, a man who could read and write in a world where such skills in a black man were seen as dangerous weapons. He had spent countless hours studying the Bible, not just reading the sanitized passages that white ministers used to justify slavery, but diving deep into the Old Testament stories of divine vengeance, of plagues sent upon oppressors, of righteous violence sanctioned by heaven itself. And tonight, he believed, he was about to become the instrument of God's wrath. A shadow moved through their home with the silence of smoke, the precision of a man who had planned this moment down to the smallest detail. Will Francis, one of Nat's most trusted followers, had already slipped inside through an upstairs window, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden floors. The front door opened without a creak, its hinges recently oiled by the very man who was about to die behind it. The first to enter was Hark Travis, an enslaved man who had known this house intimately, had swept these floors, had served meals in these rooms, had been both caretaker and prisoner within these walls. Behind him came Henry Porter, Sam Francis, and Nelson Williams, men whose names would be forgotten by history, but whose actions this night would echo through the ages. And finally, Nat Turner himself stepped across the threshold, bringing with him not just the promise of violence, but the weight of centuries of accumulated rage, the fury of generations of stolen Africans who had died in chains, dreaming of freedom they would never see. Joseph Travis stirred in his sleep, perhaps sensing some disturbance in the atmosphere of his home. His eyes fluttered open just in time to see Will Francis standing over his bed, hatchet raised against the candlelit ceiling. Travis had time for one sharp intake of breath, one moment of absolute terror as he realized that his property had become his executioner. The hatchet fell with a wet thud that seemed to echo through the entire house. Blood sprayed across the white sheets, across Sally Travis's face, across the religious sampler hanging on the wall that proclaimed, "God bless this home." Travis's body convulsed once, twice, then lay still, his life flowing out of him to stain the pine floorboards his enslaved workers had laid with their own hands. Sally Travis woke to the warm wetness of her husband's blood on her cheek. In the flickering candlelight, she saw faces she recognized, black faces that had served her family faithfully for years, now transformed into something from her deepest nightmares. Her mouth opened to scream, but Will Francis's hatchet silenced her forever before the sound could escape her throat. The children came next. Putnam Moore, a young apprentice who had been learning the wheelwright trade, was dispatched with methodical efficiency. The youngest children, including an infant who would never have the chance to grow up and become a slave owner, were killed with the same ruthless precision. 5 people dead in less than 10 minutes. The rebellion that would terrorize the entire South had begun not with speeches or declarations, but with the simple, brutal mathematics of revenge. An eye for an eye, a life for a life, blood for blood. But this was just the beginning. As Nat Turner stood in the blood-soaked bedroom, staring at what his followers had done in his name, he felt no remorse, no horror at the carnage around him. Instead, he felt something that had been denied to him his entire life: power. For the first time in 31 years of bondage, he was no longer the victim. Tonight, he was the hand of divine justice, and there was so much more justice to dispense. His name was Nat Turner, and by the time the sun rose over Southampton County, 55 white people would be dead by his command, and the course of American history would be forever changed. But how does a man of God become the architect of such carnage? How does a preacher who had spent his life teaching love and salvation become the leader of one of the most brutal uprisings in American history? How does a man who could quote scripture from memory transform into something that white Southerners would describe as the very incarnation of evil? The answer lies not in the darkness of one man's soul, but in the twisted, corrupted world of American slavery itself. A world where faith and fury would collide in ways that still haunt this nation today. A world so brutal, so dehumanizing, so completely evil that it could transform a man of peace into an angel of death. To understand Nat Turner's rebellion, you first have to understand the hell that created it. You have to understand Southampton County, Virginia, in 1831, a place where the American dream and the American nightmare existed side by side, where churches preached about human dignity on Sunday morning, while human beings were bought and sold like cattle on Monday afternoon. Southampton County wasn't just any place in the antebellum South. It was the very heart of slave country, a region where the entire economy, the entire social structure, the entire way of life was built on the systematic brutalization of human beings who happened to have been born with dark skin. Picture this landscape of horror. Over 6,000 enslaved people living in constant fear and desperation, surrounded by 9,000 white residents who owned them, controlled every aspect of their lives, and could kill them without legal consequence. This wasn't just inequality. This wasn't just poverty. This was a system of absolute power that reduced human beings to the legal status of farm animals. Every morning, black men, women, and children woke up in windowless slave quarters that were often worse than the barns where valuable livestock were housed. They woke up knowing they weren't human beings in the eyes of the law. They were property, valued at somewhere between $300 and $100 and $200 depending on their age, health, and skills. 3/5 of a person at best, according to the Constitution that was supposed to guarantee liberty and justice for all. Their bodies didn't belong to them. Their labor didn't belong to them. Their children didn't belong to them. Everything they were, everything they produced, everything they loved could be bought, sold, traded, or destroyed at the whim of their white owners. The sound that defined Southampton County wasn't the chirping of birds or the rustling of leaves in the tobacco fields. It was the crack of whips cutting through human flesh, the rattle of chains as work gangs moved from field to field, the sobbing of mothers as their children were sold away to distant plantations, never to be seen again. Imagine waking up every day knowing that you might be beaten for looking at a white person the wrong way, for speaking when you hadn't been spoken to, for showing any sign of the intelligence and humanity that your oppressors were desperately trying to deny. Imagine living every moment of your life knowing that your wife, your daughter, your sister could be raped by your master, and there was absolutely nothing you could do about it except watch and try to comfort them afterward. Imagine watching your children grow up knowing they would inherit your chains, that all the love you poured into them, all the dreams you had for their future, would be crushed under the weight of the same system that was crushing you. But here's where the evil of slavery revealed its most insidious dimension. The white masters of Southampton County didn't rely solely on whips and chains and economic coercion to maintain their system of human bondage. They weaponized the very thing that was supposed to offer hope and comfort to the oppressed. They weaponized religion itself. Every Sunday morning, in churches throughout Southampton County, Enslaved people were forced to sit in segregated sections and listen to white preachers twist the word of God into a justification for their suffering. These weren't fringe theologians or radical extremists. These were mainstream Protestant ministers, educated men who had studied the Bible extensively and chosen to pervert its message in service of maintaining their economic and social advantages. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, they would intone, reading from Ephesians while carefully ignoring the verses about setting the captives free. The meek shall inherit the earth, they would proclaim, suggesting that enslaved people should accept their brutalization as a divine test of their faith. Turn the other cheek, they would command, as if there were some spiritual value in allowing yourself to be beaten into submission. Christianity, the religion that was supposed to offer hope to the hopeless and freedom to the oppressed, became a tool of psychological warfare designed to make black people accept their suffering as God's will. The same Bible that told the story of Moses leading the Israelites out of bondage was used to convince African Americans that their bondage was part of God's plan. The psychological torture was almost worse than the physical abuse. At least when a master beat you, you knew he was evil. But when he forced you to thank God for your chains, when he made you sing hymns about heavenly freedom while denying you earthly liberty, when he convinced you that your suffering was somehow holy, that was a violation of the soul that cut deeper than any whip. This was the world that shaped Nat Turner, the world that would ultimately transform him from a man of faith into an instrument of divine vengeance. But to understand how that transformation occurred, you have to understand not just the external circumstances of his life, but the internal fire that burned within him from the moment he was born into bondage. The irony was suffocating, thick as the Virginia humidity that made everything in Southampton County feel heavy and oppressive. The same Bible that spoke of freedom for the oppressed, of justice rolling down like waters, of a God who heard the cries of the suffering and delivered them from their enemies, was being used to justify the most brutal system of human bondage the world had ever seen. White preachers stood in pulpits every Sunday morning, looked out at congregations that included hundreds of enslaved people forced to attend services, and proclaimed with straight faces that slavery was part of God's divine plan. They quoted Paul's letters about slaves obeying masters, while conveniently ignoring Jesus' teachings about setting the captives free and bringing good news to the poor. They preached about the patience of Job, while their own congregants were being worked to death in tobacco fields. They sang hymns about heavenly mansions while forcing their property to sleep in windowless shacks. They prayed for God's mercy while showing none to the human beings they bought and sold like livestock. The twisted theology of slavery wasn't just hypocrisy. It was something far more sinister. It was the systematic perversion of humanity's deepest spiritual longings in service of economic exploitation. It was taking the very thing that was supposed to offer hope to the hopeless and using it as another chain around the necks of the oppressed. But here's what those white preachers never understood, what they couldn't comprehend in their spiritual blindness. Some of the enslaved people sitting in those segregated pews were reading the same Bible they were reading, and they were coming to very different conclusions about what God wanted them to do. And in this world of twisted faith and institutionalized cruelty, a child was born who would change everything. A child who would read the same scriptures as his oppressors, but interpret them through the lens of his own suffering, his own understanding of justice, his own direct communication with the divine. But before we understand the prophet of vengeance, we need to understand the forces that forged him in the fires of bondage. Nat Turner was born into this hell on October 2, 1800. On a plantation owned by Benjamin Turner in Southampton County. But unlike the vast majority of enslaved children, who were deliberately kept ignorant to make them easier to control, Nat had something that was both a blessing and a curse. He could read. His mother, Nancy, was a woman of remarkable intelligence and fierce determination who had been born in Africa and retained memories of a world where black people were not property. She recognized something special in her son from an early age, something that made her willing to take enormous risks to nurture his mind despite the dangers involved. Teaching a slave to read was illegal in many parts of the South, and even where it wasn't explicitly forbidden, it was seen as dangerous and subversive. Literate slaves were considered a threat to the entire system because literacy led to ideas, and ideas led to questions about why some human beings should own others. But Benjamin Turner, Nat's first owner, was apparently more liberal than most, and he allowed Nancy to teach her son the fundamentals of reading and writing. It was a decision that would ultimately help unleash one of the bloodiest chapters in American history. While other enslaved children played with corncob dolls and learned to walk behind plows, Nat devoured every piece of written material he could find. He read agricultural manuals and legal documents, newspapers when he could get his hands on them, and whatever books existed in the Turner household. But most importantly, most fatefully, he read the Bible. Not just the carefully selected passages that white ministers used to justify slavery, but the entire Bible, cover to cover, over and over again. He read about Moses confronting Pharaoh and demanding that his people be set free. He read about the plagues that God sent upon Egypt when Pharaoh refused to release the Israelites. He read about the angel of death passing over Hebrew homes while striking down the firstborn of their oppressors. He read about David slaying Goliath, about Gideon defeating the Midianites, about Joshua bringing down the walls of Jericho. He read about righteous anger and divine justice, about God as a warrior who fought for the oppressed and struck down their enemies. While white preachers focused on the New Testament passages about turning the other cheek and rendering unto Caesar, Nat Turner was drawn to the Old Testament stories of liberation through divine violence. While they preached about patience and submission, he read about immediate action and holy war. From childhood, strange things happened around Nat that set him apart from other enslaved people and marked him, in their eyes, as someone touched by the supernatural. He had visions and prophetic dreams. He claimed to see hieroglyphic characters burned into trees and blood drops on corn leaves. He described conversations with spirits and angels who revealed future events to him. Whether these experiences were genuine mystical encounters, the products of an extraordinary imagination, or symptoms of the psychological trauma inflicted by slavery, they had a profound effect on both Nat and the enslaved community around him. Other slaves began to see him as a prophet, a black Moses who might one day lead them out of bondage. His reputation for supernatural insight spread throughout Southampton County's slave quarters. People came to him for spiritual guidance, for interpretations of dreams, for predictions about the future. He became a preacher and teacher, conducting secret religious services in the woods where enslaved people could worship without the interference of white overseers. But Nat wasn't just absorbing the Bible passively. He was interpreting it through the lens of his own experience, his own suffering, his own burning desire for justice. When he read about God's anger toward oppressors, he didn't see ancient history. He saw contemporary relevance. When he read about divine judgment falling upon the wicked, he didn't see metaphor. He saw prophecy. As Nat matured from childhood into adolescence and then into adulthood, his understanding of his own role in God's plan became increasingly clear. He wasn't just a preacher or a prophet. He was a chosen instrument of divine justice, called to do more than simply comfort the afflicted. He was called to afflict the comfortable. The same Bible that white masters used to justify slavery was revealing to Nat Turner a very different message: that God hated oppression, that divine justice demanded action, and that sometimes the Almighty used human hands to execute his judgment upon the earth. By the time Nat Turner reached his 30th birthday, he had become something that struck terror into the heart of every slaveholder in the South, even though they didn't yet know he existed. An educated, intelligent, charismatic enslaved person who believed God was speaking directly to him. And God, according to Nat Turner, was very, very angry about slavery. But it would take a sign from heaven itself, a celestial event that Nat interpreted as divine authorization for what he was contemplating, to transform this underground prophet into the leader of the most feared slave rebellion in American history. As Nat Turner grew from a young man into full adulthood, his reputation as a prophet and spiritual leader continued to grow throughout the enslaved community of Southampton County. But he was also developing something else, something that would prove far more dangerous to the system that held him in bondage: a sophisticated theological framework that justified violent resistance to oppression. This wasn't the crude desire for revenge that any brutalized person might feel. This was a carefully constructed religious worldview that saw slavery not just as a human institution, but as a cosmic evil that demanded divine intervention. In Nat's understanding, the enslaved people of America were like the Israelites in Egypt, crying out for deliverance from Pharaoh. And just as God had used Moses to liberate his chosen people through a series of increasingly violent plagues, he would use someone to liberate the enslaved through righteous violence. Nat studied the patterns of divine intervention throughout biblical history. He noticed that God rarely asked the oppressed to simply wait patiently for their deliverance. Instead, he called them to action, often violent action, against their oppressors. The Israelites didn't defeat their enemies through passive resistance. They conquered the Promised Land with swords and divine assistance. This theological understanding was reinforced by Nat's own mystical experiences. which continued and intensified as he grew older. He claimed to have regular conversations with the Spirit, who revealed to him not just the future, but his own role in bringing that future about. These weren't vague, metaphorical visions. They were specific, detailed instructions about what he was supposed to do and when he was supposed to do it. In 1825, Nat experienced what he later described as his most significant vision. He claimed to have seen white spirits and black spirits battling in the sky, with the black spirits eventually triumphant. He interpreted this as a prophecy that enslaved people would eventually overcome their oppressors, but only through violent struggle. The vision also revealed to him that he was to be the instrument of this divine justice. He was to wait for a sign from heaven, and when that sign appeared, he was to slay my enemies with their own weapons, taking the tools of oppression and turning them against the oppressors themselves. For 6 years after this vision, Nat waited. He continued preaching to his fellow enslaved people, but he also began quietly identifying those who might be willing to join him when the time came for action. He looked for men who shared his faith, but also his rage, who understood that sometimes God called his people not just to suffer patiently, but to fight righteously. He found them. Henry Porter, a man whose wife had been sold away from him and whose children had been scattered across 3 different plantations. Hark Travis, who bore scars from countless whippings and had watched his sister die from overwork in the cotton fields. Sam Francis and Nelson Williams, men who had maintained their dignity and their faith despite years of systematic dehumanization. These weren't random criminals or natural-born killers. They were Sunday school teachers, church leaders, men respected in their community for their moral character and spiritual insight. They were also men who had reached the same terrible conclusion as Nat Turner, that God was calling them to take justice into their own hands. Throughout the late 1820s and early 1830s, these men met in secret, usually in the deep woods or in slave quarters after the white overseers had gone to sleep. They prayed together, studied scripture together, and gradually developed what would become the most audacious plan in the history of American slavery. They would move through Southampton County, like the angel of death had moved through Egypt, striking down the oppressors in their own homes, liberating their fellow enslaved people, and establishing a kingdom of God on earth, where all people were truly free and equal. It was an incredible plan, born from incredible desperation and incredible faith. But it was also a plan that required perfect timing, perfect coordination, and most importantly, a clear sign from heaven that the moment for action had arrived. The year 1831 began with strange omens that Nat Turner interpreted as divine communications. First came a solar eclipse in February that darkened the sky in the middle of the day and sent animals fleeing in panic. Then, throughout the spring and summer, there were reports of unusual atmospheric phenomena, the sun appearing bluish-green on some days, mysterious black spots visible on the solar surface, and an aurora borealis that was visible as far south as Virginia. For most people in Southampton County, these were curious natural phenomena that might be mentioned in letters to relatives or discussed over dinner. For Nat Turner, they were messages from the Almighty, cosmic telegraph signals announcing that the time for divine justice was at hand. The final sign came on August 13, 1831, when another solar eclipse darkened the Virginia sky. As Nat later testified, this eclipse was accompanied by a vision in which he saw white spirits and black spirits engaged in battle, and the sun was darkened, the thunder rolled in the heavens, and blood flowed in streams. This wasn't mental illness speaking, despite what many white historians would later claim in their attempts to dismiss the rebellion as the product of a deranged mind. This was a man who had been systematically brutalized, dehumanized, and oppressed for 31 years, finally receiving what he interpreted as divine permission to fight back against his oppressors. The eclipse wasn't just a celestial event for Nat Turner. It was God's green light for revolution, the heavenly authorization he had been waiting for since his great vision 6 years earlier. The time for patience was over. The time for action had arrived. On the night of August 13, 1831, Nat Turner called his closest followers together in the woods near his cabin. In the darkness, lit only by a small fire, he told them that the Lord had finally given him the sign he had been waiting for. The time had come to slay my enemies with their own weapons and to fight against the serpent, for the time was fast approaching when the first should be last and the last should be first. He began to lay out the plan in detail. They would start with his current master, Joseph Travis, because the element of surprise was essential to their success. They would kill every white person they encountered, sparing no one, because this was to be God's judgment upon the entire system of slavery. not just revenge against particularly cruel masters. They would move from house to house, plantation to plantation, gathering weapons and recruiting more followers as they went. Their ultimate goal was to reach the county seat of Jerusalem and capture the armory there. With military weapons in their hands, they could hold off white militias long enough for enslaved people across the South to rise up and join their rebellion. It was an audacious plan, a desperate plan, a plan born from a lifetime of suffering and a faith that had been twisted by injustice into something dark and terrible and utterly committed to the cause of freedom, whatever the cost. The men knelt in a circle around the fire and swore sacred oaths to see their mission through to the bitter end. They prayed for God's blessing on their undertaking, for strength to do what needed to be done, and for forgiveness for the blood they were about to shed in the name of justice. As they prepared for what Nat Turner believed would be the beginning of a holy war that would finally end slavery in America, none of them could have imagined how their actions would reverberate through history, how their names would be whispered in slave quarters across the South, how their rebellion would strike terror into the hearts of slaveholders and inspire generations of freedom fighters. The die had been cast. The moment of divine vengeance was at hand. But as Nat Turner prepared to transform from prophet to revolutionary, forces beyond his control were already conspiring against him. The same system that had created him would soon deploy all of its considerable power to destroy him. The same society that had driven him to desperate action would respond with desperate violence of its own. The rebellion that was about to begin would last only 48 hours, but its consequences would echo through American history for generations to come. The night of August 20th, 1831, was unlike any other in Nat Turner's life. Tomorrow would be the day when 31 years of accumulated rage, injustice, and divine calling would finally explode into action. The day when the enslaved people of Southampton County would stop being victims and become instruments of God's wrath. But even prophets have moments of human doubt, and as Nat lay on his straw mattress in the cramped slave quarters, staring at the rough wooden ceiling above him, questions tormented his mind like demons. What if they were discovered before they could begin? What if his carefully chosen followers lost their nerve at the crucial moment? What if he had misinterpreted God's will? And this bloody path he was about to embark upon was not divine justice, but simply human vengeance dressed up in religious rhetoric. These doubts clawed at him in the darkness. But then he remembered. He remembered every crack of the whip he had heard cutting through human flesh. He remembered every anguished cry of mothers whose children had been sold away like livestock. He remembered every brutal rape he had witnessed, every casual murder he had seen, every act of dehumanization that had been inflicted on his people for generations. He remembered the white preachers standing in their pulpits, using God's holy word to justify the most unholy system of oppression imaginable. He remembered the slaveholders kneeling in prayer on Sunday morning, and then returning to their fields on Monday to brutalize the very people they claimed were made in God's image. No, there could be no doubt. Justice didn't just demand action, it demanded blood. The blood of the innocent had been crying out from the ground for 2 centuries. Tomorrow, the blood of the guilty would finally answer. The morning of August 21st dawned hot and humid, the kind of oppressive Virginia weather that made everything feel heavy and sluggish. But there was something else in the air that morning, something that seemed to make the very atmosphere crackle with potential energy. Even the birds seemed quieter than usual, as if nature itself was holding its breath. At around 2 a.m. on August 22nd, as the county slept in the false security of their assumed superiority, Nat Turner and his 6 original conspirators crept through the darkness toward the Travis house. They moved like shadows, their bare feet making no sound on the packed earth paths that connected the slave quarters to the main house. The Travis house stood before them, peaceful and vulnerable, its white wooden walls gleaming in the moonlight like a beacon of the very system they were about to attack. Inside, Joseph Travis slept beside his wife Sally, completely unaware that his property had become his executioner. Will Francis, one of the younger members of the group, proved to be remarkably agile as he scaled the side of the house and slipped through an upstairs window that had been left open to catch any breeze that might provide relief from the stifling heat. He moved through the dark house like a ghost, his heart pounding but his movements precise and controlled. The front door opened without a sound. Its hinges had been oiled just days before by Hark Travis, an enslaved man who had maintained this house faithfully for years, never knowing that his intimate knowledge of its every detail would soon be used to facilitate the murder of its occupants. One by one, the rebels slipped inside. Henry Porter, whose wife had been sold away from him 5 years earlier, and whose grief had fermented into rage. Sam Francis, who bore scars from a whipping he had received for the crime of learning to write his own name. Nelson Williams, whose sister had died in childbirth after being forced to work in the fields until the moment her labor began. These weren't monsters creeping through the Travis house. They were men who had been systematically brutalized and dehumanized for their entire lives. Men who had finally reached the point where anything seemed preferable to continued submission. And finally, Nat Turner himself stepped across the threshold, bringing with him not just the promise of violence, but the weight of what he believed was divine authorization for what was about to occur. In his mind, he wasn't breaking into a house to commit murder. He was entering Egypt to begin the plagues that would finally force Pharaoh to let his people go. Joseph Travis stirred in his sleep, perhaps sensing some disturbance in the atmosphere of his home, some change in the energy that even unconscious minds can sometimes detect. His eyes fluttered open in the dim candlelight just in time to see Will Francis standing beside his bed, hatchet raised against the ceiling. For a moment that lasted an eternity, the two men looked at each other. Master and slave, oppressor and oppressed, separated by a gulf of power and privilege that was about to be bridged by violence. Travis's eyes widened as he realized what was happening, as the comfortable assumptions of a lifetime crumbled in the space of a heartbeat. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to plead, perhaps to threaten, perhaps simply to ask why. But Will Francis had heard enough words from white masters to last several lifetimes. The hatchet fell with a wet, final sound that seemed to echo through the entire house and beyond, into the very foundations of the system that had made this moment inevitable. Blood sprayed across the white cotton sheets, across Sally Travis's sleeping face, across the religious sampler hanging on the wall that proclaimed, "God bless this home," in carefully embroidered letters. Joseph Travis's body convulsed once, twice, and then lay still, his life flowing out of him to stain the pine floorboards that his enslaved workers had laid with their own hands. Sally Travis woke to the warm wetness of her husband's blood on her cheek and the metallic taste of it on her lips. In the flickering candlelight, she saw faces she recognized, black faces that had served her family faithfully for years, faces she had looked at every day without really seeing the humanity behind them, now transformed into something from her deepest nightmares. Her mouth opened to scream, but Will Francis was already in motion, his hatchet cutting through the humid air to silence her forever, before the sound could escape her throat. The same hands that had served her meals and washed her clothes now ended her life with mechanical efficiency. The children came next, dispatched with the same methodical precision. Putnam Moore, a young apprentice who had been learning the wheelwright trade and dreaming of a future that would never come. The youngest children, including an infant who had drawn perhaps a dozen breaths in this world and would never draw another. In less than 15 minutes, 5 people were dead. The rebellion that would terrorize the entire South for generations to come had begun not with grand speeches or declarations of independence, but with the simple, brutal mathematics of an eye for an eye, a life for a life, blood for blood. As Nat Turner stood in the blood-soaked bedroom of the Travis house, looking at the carnage that had been wrought in his name and at his command, he felt no horror, no remorse, no regret for the violence that had just shattered the night. Instead, he felt something that had been denied to him for 31 years of bondage. Power. For the first time in his life, he was not the victim. For the first time, he was not powerless in the face of injustice. For the first time, he was the one dispensing judgment rather than receiving it. The taste of blood was on his lips, literally and figuratively, and he found it sweet with the promise of justice finally served. But this was only the beginning. There were dozens more houses to visit, hundreds more white people to kill, and an entire system of oppression to bring crashing down. The angel of death had begun his work in Southampton County, and there would be no rest until that work was finished. As they prepared to leave the Travis house and continue their bloody mission, Nat Turner gathered his followers around him in the candlelit parlor. The walls were decorated with portraits of the Travis family, their painted eyes seeming to watch accusingly from their gilt frames. But Nat was no longer concerned with the judgment of white people, living or dead. He served a higher authority now. "Remember," he told his men, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "we are not murderers. We are instruments of divine justice. Every blow we strike tonight is a blow struck by the hand of God himself against the enemies of our people." His followers nodded, their faces reflecting the same mixture of determination and religious fervor that burned in their leader's eyes. They were no longer enslaved people stealing through the night to commit crimes. They were soldiers in a holy war, agents of a cosmic justice that had been delayed far too long. And there was so much more justice to dispense before the sun rose on Southampton County. The rebels moved through the Virginia countryside like a plague of divine retribution, their numbers growing with each house they visited, each family they destroyed, each small victory that proved to the enslaved people of the county that resistance was not only possible, but blessed by heaven itself. Their next target was the Francis house, home to the family that owned Sam Francis, one of Nat's original conspirators. The irony was not lost on any of them, that Sam would help kill the very people who claimed to own his body and soul. The Francis family died as the Travis family had died, quickly and without mercy. But something significant happened at this house that would shape the rest of the rebellion. Other enslaved people, witnessing the successful attack, began to join Nat's army voluntarily. Some came eagerly, having waited years for just such an opportunity. Others were pressured or coerced into participating. But all of them understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented in American history. Enslaved people taking control of their own destiny through organized violence. By dawn on August 22nd, Nat Turner's small band of 6 had grown to nearly 20 armed men. They had horses taken from the plantations they had attacked. They had weapons seized from their victims. Most importantly, they had momentum. Word of the rebellion was beginning to spread through the slave quarters of Southampton County faster than the rebels themselves could move. Enslaved people who had spent their entire lives accepting brutalization as inevitable were suddenly confronted with the possibility that their oppressors were not invincible after all. Some joined the rebellion immediately. Others helped by providing information about which houses would be easiest to attack, which masters kept weapons, which roads offered the best escape routes. Still, others simply chose not to raise alarms that might have warned white families of the approaching danger. But as the sun climbed higher in the August sky and the death toll mounted, Nat Turner's rebellion was also sowing the seeds of its own destruction. The very success that was drawing new recruits to his cause was also alerting the white power structure to the magnitude of the threat they faced. The first alarm was raised around 10 a.m. when a white neighbor discovered the bodies at the Francis house. Within hours, riders were galloping across Southampton County, carrying word of the uprising to every plantation, every town, every military outpost in the region. The response was swift and overwhelming. Virginia Governor John Floyd immediately dispatched state militia units to Southampton County. Federal troops were mobilized from Norfolk. Armed white civilians formed vigilante groups and began patrolling the roads. But most significantly, the white population of Virginia and the entire South began to experience something they had never felt before: genuine terror. The comfortable assumption that their enslaved property were docile and grateful for their care was shattered forever. Every black face now seemed potentially dangerous. Every act of apparent submission now seemed possibly deceptive. The world had turned upside down in Southampton County, and white Southerners would never feel completely safe again. But for Nat Turner and his followers, racing across the Virginia countryside in the blazing heat of that August afternoon, the rebellion was just reaching its climax. They had killed nearly 40 white people in less than 24 hours. They had recruited over 70 followers. They were less than 10 miles from their ultimate target, the town of Jerusalem, where the county armory contained enough weapons to arm hundreds of additional rebels. If they could reach Jerusalem and capture those weapons, if they could hold the town long enough for enslaved people across Virginia and beyond to join their cause, they might actually succeed in their impossible dream of ending slavery through armed revolution. The next few hours would determine whether Nat Turner would go down in history as a successful revolutionary who freed his people, or as a failed rebel whose actions would bring even greater suffering to the enslaved community. But regardless of the outcome, one thing was already certain: the world would never be the same after Southampton County. The carefully constructed mythology of happy slaves and benevolent masters had been exposed as a lie written in blood. And that blood would continue to flow, on both sides, until the question of slavery in America was finally settled on the battlefields of Civil War, 30 years in the future. By Monday afternoon, August 22nd, 1831, Nat Turner's rebellion had become something that no one, including Nat himself, had quite anticipated. What had begun as a carefully planned military operation had transformed into something larger, more chaotic, and ultimately more vulnerable to the overwhelming force that the white power structure was now bringing to bear against it. The rebels had killed nearly 40 white people in less than 24 hours, a death toll that sent shockwaves not just through Southampton County, but across the entire South. More importantly, from Nat's perspective, They had recruited over 70 followers, turning his small band of conspirators into something that resembled an actual army. They had captured horses from every plantation they had attacked, giving them mobility that enslaved people had never possessed before. They had seized weapons ranging from simple farm tools to actual firearms taken from their victims' homes. They had food, supplies, and most crucially, they had the psychological advantage of having achieved the impossible. They were enslaved people who were winning. To the black population of Southampton County, Nat Turner had become something that seemed to defy the laws of nature and society. A successful slave rebel, a man who had struck back at the system that oppressed them all and lived to tell about it. His very existence proved that their masters were not invincible, that the system of slavery was not eternal, that resistance was possible. But their success was also creating the conditions for their ultimate failure. The rebellion was moving too slowly, making tactical errors that a trained military commander would never have made, but that were perhaps inevitable when leadership fell to a preacher who had learned strategy from the Bible rather than from military manuals. They were stopping at houses to loot and celebrate instead of pressing their advantage. Some of the newer recruits were getting drunk on stolen liquor, treating the rebellion like a festival rather than a war. Others were settling personal scores with particular masters instead of focusing on the larger strategic objectives. Most dangerously, word of the uprising was spreading faster than the rebels themselves could move. Every hour they delayed gave the white authorities more time to organize a response, more time to mobilize the overwhelming military superiority that would ultimately crush their dreams of freedom. By Monday evening, they were still several miles from Jerusalem, the county seat where the armory waited with its promise of military weapons that could have transformed their rebellion into something truly formidable. But between them and their goal, hastily organized militias were already forming defensive lines. The rebels attacked these defensive positions with desperate courage, but they were farmers and field hands fighting against men who had military training and superior weapons. The psychological advantage that had carried them through their first victories began to evaporate as they encountered organized resistance for the first time. More critically, some of the rebels had been captured alive during these skirmishes, and under interrogation enhanced by torture, they were revealing the names of other participants, the locations of rebel encampments, and the details of Nat's larger strategic plan. The net was closing around the remaining freedom fighters. By Tuesday morning, August 23rd, the rebellion that had terrorized Southampton County for 48 hours was effectively over. Most of the rebels were dead, captured, or scattered into the woods and swamps that surrounded the county. Their dreams of reaching Jerusalem and sparking a region-wide uprising had been crushed by the same system they had tried to overthrow. But one man had vanished like smoke into the Virginia wilderness, leaving behind only rumors and sightings and the growing legend of his name. Nat Turner, the prophet who had become a revolutionary, had disappeared into the landscape he knew better than any of his pursuers. And for 2 months, he would remain hidden while the entire South convulsed with fear and rage over what he had accomplished. Those 2 months would be some of the darkest in the history of American slavery, as white Virginians went mad with paranoia and unleashed a wave of retaliatory violence that dwarfed even the bloodshed of the rebellion itself. But they would not rest. They would not feel safe. They would not be able to return to their comfortable assumptions about slavery and race until they had Nat Turner himself in chains. The manhunt for the most dangerous man in America had begun. For 2 months after the rebellion ended, Nat Turner became something unprecedented in the history of American slavery. A free black man in the heart of slave country, living entirely outside the control of the white power structure that claimed to own him. He survived in the wilderness of Southampton County like a ghost, moving through forests and swamps that he had known since childhood, finding shelter in caves and hollow trees, subsisting on whatever food he could steal or forage. During this time, he was simultaneously the most hunted man in America and the most liberated enslaved person who had ever lived. Hundreds of soldiers, militiamen, and professional slave catchers scoured every inch of the county looking for him. Bloodhounds were brought in from across Virginia to track his scent. Rewards were offered that would have made any successful captor wealthy for life. The entire white population of the region lived in constant terror that he might emerge from the woods at any moment to resume his bloody campaign. But Nat Turner had become something more than a fugitive. He had become a symbol, a legend, a name whispered in slave quarters across the South. Some said he had been killed in the fighting and his body hidden by his followers. Others claimed he had escaped to the north and was raising an army to return and finish what he had started. Still others believed he had been taken up to heaven like Elijah, transported directly to glory as a reward for his service to God's justice. During these 2 months of freedom, the white population of Virginia and the entire South went insane with fear and retributive violence. The comfortable world they had created for themselves, based on the assumption that their enslaved property were docile and grateful, had been shattered beyond repair. Over 120 black people were murdered in retaliation during these weeks, most of whom had absolutely nothing to do with the rebellion. Any enslaved person who showed the slightest sign of defiance or independence was suspected of being a potential rebel. Any gathering of black people was seen as a possible conspiracy. Any expression of religious faith that didn't explicitly endorse slavery was viewed as seditious. Heads were mounted on poles along major roads as warnings to other potential rebels. Bodies were mutilated and burned in public spectacles designed to terrorize the entire black population into absolute submission. The violence was so extreme, so indiscriminate, and so brutal that even some white officials were horrified by what their own people were doing. But the bloodlust could not be satisfied, the fear could not be quieted, and the white South could not return to its previous sense of security until they had the man who had started it all. On October 30th, 1831, that manhunt finally came to an end in the most anticlimactic way imaginable. Benjamin Phipps, a local white farmer, was hunting in the woods near his property when he noticed something that seemed out of place, a small depression in the ground that looked almost like a grave, covered with fence rails and dirt, in a way that seemed too deliberate to be natural. When he investigated more closely, moving aside the makeshift camouflage, he found himself staring into a pair of human eyes that belonged to the most feared man in America. Nat Turner, the prophet of Southampton County, the Black Moses who had terrorized the slave-holding South, the man whose name had become synonymous with white nightmares about slave rebellion, was found cowering in a hole in the ground like a hunted animal. He was emaciated from months of poor nutrition, exhausted from constant vigilance, and resigned to the fate that had always been inevitable from the moment he first raised his hand against his oppressors. But even in chains, even facing certain death, even reduced to the most pitiful circumstances imaginable, Nat Turner remained defiant. When Phipps asked if he regretted his actions, Nat replied with words that would echo through history. "I am here loaded with chains and willing to suffer the fate that awaits me." When pressed further about whether he believed his rebellion had been wrong, he gave an answer that captured the essence of his entire worldview. Was not Christ crucified? The capture of Nat Turner created a sensation throughout the country. Newspapers from New York to New Orleans carried detailed accounts of his arrest. Politicians used his rebellion to argue for everything from the immediate abolition of slavery to its expansion into new territories. Religious leaders debated whether his actions represented divine judgment on America or demonic possession of an individual. But for the legal system of Southampton County, there was never any doubt about how this story would end. The trial of Nat Turner was scheduled to begin within days of his capture, and its outcome was predetermined by 2 centuries of legal precedent that denied basic human rights to anyone with African ancestry. No court in 1831, Virginia was going to acquit a black man who had killed white children, regardless of the circumstances that had driven him to rebellion. But the trial would serve a different and perhaps more important purpose. It would give white America a chance to look into the mind of the man who had shattered their comfortable assumptions about slavery and race, and what they saw there would haunt them for generations to come. The trial of Nat Turner began on November 5, 1831, in the courthouse of Jerusalem, Virginia, the same town that had been his ultimate military objective during the rebellion. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. The man who had tried to capture Jerusalem as the symbolic capital of his revolutionary kingdom was now being tried for his life in Jerusalem as a common criminal. The courthouse was packed with white spectators who had come to see the most dangerous man in America in person. Many had expected to find a monster, someone whose physical appearance would reflect the evil that white newspapers had attributed to him. Instead, they saw a small, thin, unremarkable black man who looked more like a country preacher than a military commander. But when Nat Turner spoke, when he began to explain his actions and his motivations, the crowd fell silent. This was not the rambling testimony of a madman or the desperate lies of a common criminal. This was the measured, articulate, biblically informed explanation of a man who had thought deeply about justice, oppression, and the role of violence in social change. Thomas Gray, the white lawyer who had been appointed to represent Turner, was fascinated enough by his client's story to conduct extensive interviews with him during the weeks leading up to the trial. These interviews would later be published as The Confessions of Nat Turner, one of the most important and controversial documents in American slavery history. In his confession, Nat showed no remorse for what he had done. He described his visions in detail, explained his interpretation of biblical prophecy, and made it clear that he believed his rebellion was not just justified, but commanded by God himself. He was not apologizing for his actions. He was explaining why they had been necessary. When Gray asked if he now believed he had been wrong to lead the rebellion, Nat's response was chilling in its calm certainty. I am satisfied with what I have done. I believe I was acting according to the will of the Almighty. This was not what white Virginia wanted to hear. They had expected either madness or repentance, either clear mental illness that would allow them to dismiss the rebellion as meaningless, or clear remorse that would validate their belief in the ultimate justice of their system. Instead, they got something far more disturbing: rational, intelligent, religiously grounded resistance to slavery itself. Nat Turner was not insane. He was not sorry. He was a man who had looked at the system of human bondage and concluded that it was so evil, so completely contrary to divine will, that violent resistance was not just justified, but morally required. The trial itself was a formality that lasted less than a day. The verdict was predetermined by law and custom, but the real trial, the trial of slavery itself in the court of public opinion, would continue for decades. On November 11, 1831, Nat Turner was hanged in Jerusalem, Virginia, before a crowd of thousands who had come to witness the execution of the man who had terrorized their world. Even at the gallows, with the noose around his neck and death only moments away, he maintained the dignity and conviction that had carried him through 2 months in the wilderness and weeks in chains. His last words were reported differently by different witnesses, but all agreed that he died without begging for mercy or expressing regret for his actions. To the very end, he believed he had been an instrument of divine justice. But white Virginia's revenge against Nat Turner did not end with his death. His body was skinned, and the skin was made into purses and other leather goods that were kept as souvenirs. His bones were ground up and used to make grease. His head was removed and kept as a trophy. They were so terrified of Nat Turner, so desperate to erase every trace of his physical existence, that they literally tried to consume him, to make him disappear completely from the world he had challenged so effectively. But they could not erase his memory. They could not destroy his legacy. They could not prevent his name from being whispered in slave quarters across the South, inspiring both hope and terror, depending on which side of the system you happened to be on. And they could not answer the questions that his rebellion had raised about the fundamental nature of slavery. Questions that would echo through American history until the system he had challenged was finally destroyed. The Nat Turner Rebellion sent shockwaves through the entire slave-holding South that reverberated for decades. If such a thing could happen in Virginia, the oldest and most civilized of the slave states, it could happen anywhere. If a preacher could become a revolutionary, any enslaved person might be plotting rebellion in the secrecy of their own heart. The immediate response was swift, brutal, and comprehensive. Slave codes throughout the South became even more restrictive than they had been before. Teaching enslaved people to read became a serious crime punishable by imprisonment or even death. Religious gatherings among black people were monitored, controlled, and often forbidden entirely. The few small freedoms that enslaved people had managed to carve out for themselves were systematically eliminated. Preachers were forbidden from addressing black congregations unless white overseers were present to monitor every word. The ownership of weapons by free black people was banned in most states. Travel between plantations was restricted to prevent the kind of communication networks that had made Nat Turner's rebellion possible. But most significantly, the intellectual justification for slavery underwent a fundamental transformation in response to the rebellion. Before 1831, many white Southerners had viewed slavery as a necessary evil that would eventually be phased out as economic conditions changed. After Nat Turner, slavery became a positive good that defenders claimed was beneficial for both black and white people. This wasn't just a change in rhetoric, it was a change in worldview that made the Civil War inevitable. By transforming slavery from an unfortunate inheritance from the colonial period into a divinely sanctioned social system that must be defended at all costs, the Nat Turner Rebellion helped push the South toward the radical position that would ultimately lead to secession and war. The fear that Nat Turner had instilled in the white South never completely went away. For 30 years after his rebellion, every strange noise in the night, every gathering of black people, every act of defiance by an enslaved person was viewed through the lens of potential insurrection. White families began sleeping with loaded guns beside their beds. Children were taught to be suspicious of the enslaved people who worked in their homes and had previously been considered part of the family. The easy paternalistic relationship between master and slave that had characterized much of Southern society was replaced by an atmosphere of constant tension and mutual suspicion. Southern newspapers carried regular reports of supposed slave conspiracies and planned rebellions, most of which existed only in the paranoid imaginations of white readers. But the fact that these stories were believed, that they spread panic throughout entire communities, demonstrated how completely Nat Turner had shattered white confidence in the stability of their system. The rebellion also had profound and complex effects on the enslaved community itself. For some, Nat Turner became a heroic figure, a Black David who had stood up to the white Goliath and proved that resistance was possible. His name was whispered in slave quarters across the South as a symbol of courage and defiance, an inspiration to anyone who dreamed of freedom. Folklore about Nat Turner spread throughout the Black community, often mixing historical fact with mythical elements. He was said to possess supernatural powers, to have received direct communications from God, to have been invulnerable to bullets during the rebellion. These stories served not just to honor his memory, but to keep alive the possibility that others might follow in his footsteps. But for other enslaved people, especially those who suffered direct retaliation after the rebellion, Nat Turner represented the dangerous consequences of open resistance. They had watched as innocent Black people were murdered by vengeful white mobs, had seen families destroyed and communities terrorized in response to his actions. For these people, Nat Turner's legacy was more complicated. They could admire his courage while questioning his judgment, respect his commitment to freedom while regretting the suffering that his rebellion had brought to their community. This tension between admiration and regret, between inspiration and caution, would characterize Black responses to Nat Turner for generations. He was simultaneously a hero and a cautionary tale, a symbol of resistance and a reminder of its costs. But perhaps most importantly, Nat Turner had proved something that white supremacists had desperately tried to deny: that enslaved people would never willingly accept their bondage, that the system of slavery could only be maintained through constant, overwhelming violence, and that such violence would inevitably provoke a response. The Nat Turner Rebellion was a preview of the Civil War that would come 30 years later, a demonstration that slavery could not be reformed or made humane, but could only be maintained through force or destroyed through even greater force. It showed that America would never be able to live peacefully with the contradiction at its heart, the gap between its professed ideals of freedom and equality and its actual practice of human bondage. That contradiction would have to be resolved one way or another, and Nat Turner had shown that enslaved people themselves would play a role in determining how that resolution occurred. The questions that his rebellion raised about the nature of justice, the limits of oppression, and the right of the oppressed to violent resistance would echo through American history long after his death. They would inspire abolitionists in the North and terrify slaveholders in the South. They would influence everything from Underground Railroad operations to John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry to the decision of hundreds of thousands of enslaved people to flee to Union lines during the Civil War. But the most important legacy of Nat Turner was not his rebellion itself, but the challenge he presented to American society's understanding of slavery and race. He forced the nation to confront questions it had been avoiding, to acknowledge realities it had been denying, to choose sides in a conflict that could no longer be ignored or compromised away. In doing so, he helped make the Civil War inevitable. And in making the Civil War inevitable, he helped make the end of slavery inevitable as well. The blood that was shed in Southampton County in August 1831 was a down payment on the much greater bloodshed that would come in the 1860s. But that later war would accomplish what Nat Turner's rebellion could not: the complete destruction of the system that had created the conditions for his desperate act of resistance. But even beyond the immediate political and social consequences of his actions, Nat Turner raised fundamental questions about the nature of justice, oppression, and resistance that remain relevant today. In a world where systematic injustice continues to exist, where some people continue to be treated as less than fully human, where peaceful protest is often ignored or suppressed, the example of Nat Turner continues to challenge us to think about when violence becomes not just understandable, but morally justified. These are uncomfortable questions for a society that prefers to believe in the power of peaceful change and gradual reform. But they are questions that every generation must face when confronted with systems of oppression that seem immune to other forms of pressure. Nat Turner believed he had heard the voice of God commanding him to take up arms against his oppressors. But maybe what he really heard was the voice of justice itself, crying out from the blood of generations of murdered, tortured, and enslaved people, demanding that someone, somewhere, finally say, enough. Maybe the real question is not whether Nat Turner was a prophet or a terrorist, a liberator or a murderer. Maybe the real question is what happens to a society when oppression becomes so total, so dehumanizing, so completely evil, that violence begins to seem like the only language that power understands. That was the question that Nat Turner posed to America in 1831. It is a question that echoes through our history and continues to challenge us today. Because the story of Nat Turner is not just about the past. It is about the price of injustice, the limits of patience, and the terrible arithmetic of systematic oppression. How much suffering can a people endure before they decide that anything, even hopeless rebellion, is better than continued submission? It is about what happens when the promise of equality remains unfulfilled for so long that people begin to lose faith in peaceful solutions and start looking for more direct ways to claim their rights. It is about the responsibility that all of us have to recognize and address injustice before it reaches the point where violence begins to seem like the only option left. These are the lessons of Nat Turner's rebellion, lessons written in blood across the landscape of Southampton County, but relevant far beyond the boundaries of Virginia or the era of slavery. Was he a murderer or a liberator? A prophet or a terrorist? Or was he simply a man who looked at an evil system and decided that he would rather die fighting it than live accepting it? These are the questions that Nat Turner's bloody rebellion forces us to confront. Questions about justice and violence, about faith and fury, about the price of freedom and the cost of oppression. Questions that America has been trying to answer for nearly 200 years. Questions that we are still trying to answer today. This was the story of Nat Turner, the prophet of Virginia, who led the bloodiest slave revolt in U.S. history. A man who believed that God had called him to strike down his oppressors with his own hands. A shadow who refused to be forgotten, whose legacy continues to challenge our understanding of justice, resistance, and the lengths to which people will go in pursuit of freedom. His rebellion lasted only 48 hours, but its consequences echoed through American history for generations. It helped push the nation toward a civil war that would finally end the system he had tried to destroy. It inspired countless others to resist oppression in their own ways. And it posed questions about justice and violence that we are still struggling to answer. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think, if it has challenged what you thought you knew about American history and the ongoing struggle for justice and equality, then you need to subscribe to Shadows of Slavery right now. Because there are more stories like this one, more shadows from our past that deserve to be brought into the light, more truths that history tried to erase, but that remain essential to understanding who we are and how we got here. Subscribe now, because the shadows of history are still speaking, and their voices deserve to be heard.